Inventing Reality, section. Quote, inferior peoples and their hopeless ways. For centuries, imperialists have justified their mistreatment of other peoples by portraying them as wanting in ethical, cultural, and political development. If there be turmoil in some part of the Third World, then the trouble supposedly rests with the people themselves, and not with anything the intruders are doing to them. When the U.S.-supported coup overthrew Allende and led to the bloody repression of the Pinochet regime, quote, blaming the people became the media's favorite explanation. Thus, CBS commentator Eric Severid opined that the Chilean people brought it on themselves. Another Latin American example of, quote, an instability so chronic that the root causes have to lie in the nature and culture of the people. End quote. By way of explaining why Chileans would support Allende and the Popular Unity government, Bernard Collier wrote in the New York Times Magazine, quote, the Chileans do not believe in facts, numbers, or statistics with the earnest faith of an English-speaking people. End quote. While talking to a correspondent who had just reported on the rebellion and famine in Tigray, NBC anchor Tom Brokaw could only think of asking, quote, you're in London now, which is one of the most sophisticated and civilized cities in the world. Do you have much culture shock after being in that part of Africa? End quote. During the Cold War years, the Russians were a prime target of stereotypic pronouncements, described as, quote, unsmiling, rude, and unable to look you in the eye. A former Washington Post correspondent, appearing on ABC's 2020 program, declared that, quote, the Russians have a great urge for order. It is part of their personality. End quote. To which host Barbara Walters responded that the Russian people lacked, quote, a sense of responsibility because they are told what to do and when to do it. End quote. In 1991, at a time of dramatic transition within the Soviet Union, the New York Times noted that the post-communist reformers faced, quote, the mammoth task of civilizing their country. End quote. Negative and stereotypic representations of Arabs are in superabundance. A CBS correspondent ended his report on the Middle East by saying, quote, but of course, sound argument has not always dictated Arab behavior. End quote. New York Times columnist Flora Lewis saw, quote, the Islamic mind as unable to employ step-by-step thinking. End quote. Had such an assertion been applied to the Christian mind or the Hebrew mind, the Times likely would have rejected it as nonsensical and bigoted. The 1990-91 war waged by the United States against Iraq brought a plethora of anti-Arab stereotypes. Iraq is an Arab nation, but so were at least 6 of the nations allied with Washington in that war. Newsday referred to, quote, the treacherous standards of Arab politics, end quote. Judith Miller in the New York Times claimed that the Gulf Cooperation Council, in, quote, typical Arab style, made a veiled reference to the presence of U.S. forces in the Gulf. Miller would never describe an Israeli leader as making a veiled reference in, quote, typical Jewish style, end quote. U.S. News and World Report quoted Middle East specialist Judith Kipper on the devious nature of the, quote, Arab mind. Quote, we go in a straight line, they zigzag. They can say one thing in the morning, another thing at night, and really mean a third thing." End quote. New Republic editor Martin Peretz warned us, quote, "Nonviolence is foreign to the political culture of Arabs generally, and of the Palestinians particularly." End quote. Performing at his usual level of accuracy, New York Times columnist A.M. Rosenthal listed Iranians as Arabs. One of the media's favorite Middle East, quote, experts, Fuad Ajami, praised by New York Times columnist William Safir, quote, "for the amazing way he reads the Arab mind," end quote, described Iraq as, quote, "a brittle land, with little claim to culture and books and grand ideas," end quote. In fact, Iraq was the cradle of an ancient and fertile civilization. And before it was destroyed by American bombs, Baghdad was a major center of literature, art, and architecture. NPR's Susan Stanberg, interviewing two Arab intellectuals, asked them to comment on an association in her mind, quote, "Arabs and death." They patiently explained that, like everyone else, Arabs preferred life over death for themselves and their loved ones. Then she gave them another association, quote, "Arabs and violence." Stanberg was the citizen of a country in which 25,000 homicides occurred each year, along with millions of muggings, rapes, and assaults. A country that spent $300 billion yearly on the military and supported violent repression through much of the Third World, and which at that very moment was waging a murderous war against a vastly smaller and weaker Arab nation. And she was asking why Arabs were so violent. End of section.